Well, gotta admit, not quite what I was expecting, but heck, I thought it worked. As someone whose favorite genre of games just so happens to be JRPGs, I'm always on the lookout to find that next great game to help me pass the time to prepare for the holiday season, for which it always ends up being the busiest time of year for me when it comes to playing the newest games. Now, while I usually stick with the more popular and well-known titles that release over the year, sometimes you run into a unique gem that provides a fun experience, and I'm happy to say that Live Alive was the experience I'd been looking for, made even better by the fact that this title serves as a remake to the 1994 original game, and as a 90s game, came out at the right time that my love for JRPGs began, and I feel awful that I'm only finding out about this game now, as this is the type of game that I would have loved as a kid. Now, before I start, I just want to give a major shout out to a good friend of mine and fellow YouTuber who goes by the name of Miss Lady Pelvic, and to say that, heck, if it wasn't for her, I never actually would have discovered this game, because this is exactly the type of game that I really would have enjoyed wanting to play back in the day, and heck, I certainly have had a good amount of time playing this now. And she actually did her own review on this title, so I'll be sure to leave a little link to her review somewhere above me right now. Now, before I get into our review, I just want to say that going into this game, I really wasn't sure what to expect, because out of all of the classic 90 titles games of JRPGs that I was aware of, I had never actually heard of this game before. So going into this game, I think I might have perhaps semi-sabotaged my own personal experience with this game, because I very much was going to compare it and expect a level of quality compared to games like Secrets of Mana, or Chrono Trigger, or Final Fantasy VI, or Breath of Fire or Soul Blazer. That was the kind of level of quality that I was expecting from Live Alive. And while I can honestly say that this game isn't quite on that level, I still think that for the uniqueness of itself that it tries to do to have its own identity, I think it does a pretty serviceable job. And I think that anyone who hasn't heard of this game or played this game should probably give it a try, especially in this much updated remake version, which I have to say brought a lot of surprises that I really wasn't expecting in many ways. When it comes to the plot of Live Alive, the most fascinating factor I discovered was that this game doesn't tell just one story, but 8 different plots that are all self-contained and take place in different time eras with their own unique themes. Now, this in theory might sound like a creative idea at first, but in the long haul, this approach actually provided my first main problem that I had with the game, and that is the overall length of the entire experience. Because this game is divided into 8 different time periods, there's a lot of inconsistency in terms of how long it takes to beat each individual story. Some can take as long as 3 hours max to complete a certain story, while some are so short it can take in between 20 to less than an hour, granting me an overall playtime experience of less than about 18.5 hours, which for a JRPG is criminally short. And that is even when I was doing things during my playtime that were intentionally done to make this game longer than it actually was, granting Live Alive the title of being the single shortest JRPG game that I've ever played. Now, I have to state this right now, that the overall shortness of Live Alive was a genuine problem that I did have with it and was very surprised with. Now, RPGs or even JRPGs from my experience have never been known for being so short. In fact, some of those games have been the longest games to actually get a genuine experience for, because you want to get the most out of it. Heck, I've played several different genre games, including shooter games, fighting games, and heck, even some action games that were much longer than this, and that was a bit surprising. Now, I will confess that going with this approach of having this story split into 8 different self-supporting stories is an interesting idea. It gives it kind of an episodic feel, and that is something that I have never actually experienced in an RPG like this before. But I think the fact that I don't think they do as good of a job to try to unify their story into like one focused plot was certainly something that I think they could have worked on, or at least if they were remaking this, I think perhaps something they could have added to actually give it a much better feeling of unification. But again, I don't think that this hurts it too much, but I think that some people who probably would be expecting more might be a little bit disappointed in that. Now, despite the shorter than expected length, I will give credit where it's due when it comes to its storytelling, as I was really impressed with a few errors and just how much story and depth they were able to flesh out in just under a few hours at most. And some of these errors I thought were so good that they could have easily have been their own 20 to 30 hour long game. And had they been released back in the 90s, they would have undoubtedly have become instant classics. I also really appreciate how each of the eras that I did enjoy the most were able to tell not only their own unique story, but not just because they were set in different eras in time, but because they had their own unique tone of story, which in some cases felt very familiar and practical, while others had surprising twists that I not only didn't see coming in this game, but I wasn't really familiar had seen in any other JRPG title that I've played, which helped make those individual stories most memorable and enjoyable to me. But this unfortunately is not the case across the board, as there were a few eras that I particularly didn't care much for, and one specific era that ended up being one of the longer eras to complete that not only didn't have a satisfying conclusion, but ultimately I felt was a complete waste of my time. And for something like this, that's something I really don't appreciate. But I do feel that everyone who plays this game will have their own unique experience with each era and enjoys some more than others. When it comes to Live Alive's gameplay styles, it does succeed in providing all of the classic JRPG elements that one should expect. However, because there are 8 different eras to play through, there are some eras that attempt to stand apart from others by either removing key gameplay elements or providing you with a different kind of experience that you can only see in a certain era. But the one consistent element that all 8 eras share is the combat system. When you enter combat, the gameplay switches over to a time-based grid system. As you and the enemy move around the grid, your meter above your life bar will build up, and when it finishes, it will be your turn to make a move. The characters that you will have access to across all 8 different eras have different styles of attacking, and the enemy variety takes this into account, keeping combat against enemies rather balanced. As you move around, you will also have to do your best to position yourselves so that the enemy is within your attacking range, but doing your best to make sure you keep out of their attacking range at the same time when it is necessary. I actually thought the grid system actually works pretty well. In fact, several times throughout my playthroughs, I was actually impressed with how the grid size actually changed depending on the location of where you were fighting. So I was actually pretty impressed with that level of detail that it actually took the environment into account. However, it isn't exactly perfect, and I think there may be some issues with certain locations because that could lead to you actually finding ways to kind of manipulate the system a little bit, and it was something that I was able actually to do, and therefore it kind of, I don't want to say hurt my experience, but kind of made my overall experience using this grid system a little bit one-dimensional at times, and therefore felt a little bit too easy, which may be something that other players don't discover, but it was certainly something that I did discover during my playthroughs. When it comes to the eras of prehistory, Imperial China, the near future, and the Middle Age, these 4 in particular play out very traditional by having the most in common with what you would expect to see in a classic JRPG title. You will have a good amount of areas to explore which will grant you the opportunity to level grind, and as you level up your characters you will gain access to more powerful attacks. You can also switch out your equipment to enhance the performance of your characters, and even craft new weapons from materials that you can collect from either exploring or getting from winning after a battle. The Twilight era of Edo Japan incorporates a stealth exploration aspect outside of combat, and because of that, that era felt very similar to a classic Metal Gear game. While it still uses traditional JRPG elements, your objective in this era is to take out specific targets, and by relying on the use of stealth tactics, you can actually avoid combat with regular enemies. You can walk across rooftops, crawl on the ceilings, move through secret doors, or even overhear passwords that guards are using at certain times which will allow you to pass as one of their allies. And if you kill anyone, it actually can have a minor effect on your particular ending for this era. Things like this I was really impressed with, and it brought something new that actually fit this style of combat and exploration. The present day era takes on the style of an old school style fighting game like Street Fighter by having you fight a series of enemies in one-on-one fights, learning your opponent's special moves, and then using those moves against them to rise through the ranks. The Wild West era was way too linear in my opinion and really didn't give me much to do, while the Distant Future era spent most of its time focusing on exposition with an underwhelming story and therefore felt like a complete waste of my time. When it comes to Live Alive's visuals, I was absolutely blown away with the direction the developers decided to go with this updated remake. What they have done is kept the original 2D look of the characters while placing them in a 3-dimensional environment, creating a somewhat hybrid look between the 2 dimensions. Okay, I'm just going to say this. I'm absolutely in love with how this game looked visually. This mixture of 2D and 3D elements is something that more games need to do. In fact, we need to get more remakes like this, applying the visuals in this style. In fact, I really hope that there's more games that do this now because I need to go out and find them immediately. I can only imagine what games like classic 90s JRPG games like Chrono Trigger or Final Fantasy VI or Breath of Fire, I can only imagine how good they could look if they had tried using this approach with those games. We would get probably some of the best looking classic 90s games ever. And I think that if there are more games that do this, then we're in for some pretty fun experiences. But hey, I truly support this approach in terms of its visual style to the absolute fullest. With this updated remake, they decided to grant the characters voices for their dialogue. And while I can't say that any one particular performance is truly exceptional, I think they all do a solid job of the material that they are given. However, I must admit, I did have fun with the fact that in the prehistory era, since the characters didn't have any dialogue, I ended up actually voicing all the characters and giving them lines myself based on what they were doing, which is something I'd never done before and had a lot of fun with. One thing I must say is that the soundtrack for this updated version of Live Alive is nothing short of incredible. There were a number of tracks that really stood out to me in key moments throughout the game that made not only certain final battles feel epic, but key moments between characters during dialogue scenes, some of the best that I've seen in JRPGs in some time. Now in conclusion, I can say that for an overall experience, I did have a good amount of fun playing Live Alive. I would not necessarily say it was a truly great overall experience, but I think elements of it do very much scrape the bottom limit of what I would say is a great JRPG. And I understand why not many people have actually talked about this game, and while, in my personal opinion, I certainly would not even compare it, or I probably shouldn't have compared and put it on the level as like the all-time greatest 90s JRPG experiences. I perfectly understand why I just personally would not put it on that level. But I think that if you are looking for an interesting experience or something that has elements that truly have potential to be great, then this is something I would recommend. Now, if I had to give Live Alive, or at least on Nintendo Switch, a rating, I think the highest rating that I think I would give it, to be fair, is I would give it an 8 out of 10. If you are interested, I certainly would recommend getting your own copy, but if you're trying to compare it to classic older 90s titles that are more well known and probably have greater reputations, I would probably set my expectations just a little bit lower. So that was my review for Live Alive. If you did happen to enjoy this review of mine, because I actually am looking forward to actually probably reviewing more Nintendo Switch games, make sure you give me a like and subscribe. And if you have any thoughts on, if you've played Live Alive yourself or want to share your thoughts, make sure you share them with me and everyone else in the comments down below. And like always, thank you guys for watching. You're awesome, and I'll see you all next time.